Now, since we are looking at different ways to define the specialist organisms, this is another way in which we look at all these species. And this is with the help of IUCN Red List. Now, what is the meaning of IUCN Red List, and each and every aspect of it, we'll have a separate discussion on it, and that will come in the chapter of international organizations. But currently, we just need to understand how exactly they do it and what are the different ways in which the classification is being done. So if you look at the red list, this is how they define it. The screen, as you see, first is extinct. So when we talk about extinct species, these are species where we know that the last individual has, without a reasonable doubt, died. There is no other individual left for this species without any doubt. So this is there. Then after that you have extinct in the wild. So these are the organisms which now we know are not available in the wild anymore. That is, they are not present in their natural environment anymore. They are somewhere, let's say, in a captivity, somewhere in a zoo, somewhere where a lot of care is being taken. So they do not lie in their original environment anymore. They do not survive there anymore. We have been trying to conserve them by keeping them in captivity or somewhere where conservation efforts can be made. So this is how we define extinct in the wild. Then after that you have critically endangered. So critically endangered is a kind of species which has been threatened with a very near future of getting extinct. That is, the likeliness of getting extinct in the near future is very high. So the conservation efforts will be also very high, but there are high chances that it will very soon be declared as extinct in the wild. So that's why this is a category where a lot of emphasis has to be put. Then after that you have endangered. So endangered species and critical endangered species, these are two different terms. So endangered species will be the species where they are endangered, but with conservation efforts they can be saved. There is still a hope for these organisms to come back. But in case of critically endangered, we normally say that these are the kinds of individuals which may not come back unless a lot of effort is put into it. Then vulnerable is a kind of bracket in which we know that these are organisms, these are species which may become extinct in the near future or in a medium term. Currently they have started to see a decline in the population, and very soon they might have to be moved into the bracket of endangered species. So these will be called as vulnerable species. Then after that you have near threatened, where the chances of becoming vulnerable is high. Then after that we have the category of least concern. So when we talk about least concern, this is a category where we talk about these organisms, these species which currently are safe, and whether we talk about with conservation efforts or without conservation efforts, they are safe for now and there is no particular threat to them in the near future. So these can be called as least concern. And then, so these are all for the ones for which adequate data is present. These three are the most important ones. These are the threatened species, and then you have near threatened and least concern, and ultimately you also have two or more categories. One where the data is deficient, we don't know yet about these species whether or not they have any problem as such, and then there are species which have not been evaluated properly till now. Why the evaluation will not happen? Because maybe they have been discovered very recently, or the studies are still going on and we still do not have the data with respect to them, and we do not find any reason to evaluate them because we know that their populations are very high. So these are the list of species, different ways in which the species are being classified. Just remember how the classification is being done. You have, first of all the species, either they have been evaluated or they have not been evaluated. If they have been evaluated, either the data is sufficient or the data is deficient. So if data is sufficient, then after that you have all these categories: extinct in the wild. Then you have threatened categories where you have three subcategories in that, and then you have near threatened and least concern. So the risk of extinction obviously rises from here to here. These are the species either which have become extinct or are looking at a very deemed future. So this is about IUCN Red List. We'll have a discussion separately again when we go to the chapter of international organizations. Now we need to move into a very important topic, and this is loss of biodiversity. Now, when we talk about loss of biodiversity, there are various aspects that you need to understand. First of all, what is happening with biodiversity? What kind of decline are we looking at? And some of the data with respect to the same we have already seen, that how the amphibians are disappearing, what is the ratio of all the mammals that are left now, what is the status of various organisms. So some of the data with respect to these aspects we have already seen, and we know for sure that there is a loss of biodiversity that is happening, and mainly it is also happening because of human reasons, because of anthropogenic reasons. We had a discussion on extinctions, on the sixth mass extinction, and we try to understand there that what is happening with the extinction and how the rates of extinction now are very high. We had also seen certain graphs with respect to it. Now, so all these are basically clues towards loss of biodiversity. And if you look at the picture that you have on your screens, what we are looking at are ranges. So we have taken the range of 4 different species, one of Indian tigers. And if you talk about Indian tigers, just try to observe the blue and the violet ranges. So if you look at the blue range, what you look at is the population that these tigers had approximately 100 years back. And what you're looking at as purple patches are the current population of tigers, the current areas that the tigers have been occupying. Similarly, if you look at the black rhino, you see that 100 years back this whole area was being occupied by black rhino, but now these are the very small pockets where they are found, otherwise they have vanished. Similarly, if you talk about African elephants, you can see the range 100 years back and the range today, and the same goes for the elephant or the Asian elephant. In the case of Asian elephant, again we see that there are only patches which are left, only patches where they can be found. So this is an evidence to what we have been looking at. Various species have been dying out. Here we are talking about various mammals. We already discussed about amphibians, and mammals and amphibians have been the ones which have been facing the most amount of problems with respect to loss in number of individuals or the number of species that they had. So this is one more evidence that we have about the loss of biodiversity. Now, when we are talking about the loss of biodiversity, there are 3 major things that we need to understand. First of all, what are the causes of the loss? What are the causes of the loss of biodiversity that we are witnessing today? Many of these reasons we already had a discussion on, but we'll just try to combine everything at one place here. Then after that, the impact. What's the impact of loss of biodiversity? And at the same time, what are the conservation efforts that we can make? What could be the various ways in which we can try to sustain biodiversity or try to reduce the loss of biodiversity that we are looking at? So these 3 aspects become very important for you to understand from even examination point of view, and very, very important as a decision maker in future. So first of all, when we talk about the loss, there is one acronym that you should remember. This is HIPPO. This used to be a very famous acronym for causes of the loss. H stands for habitat destruction, I stands for invasive species, P for pollution, P for population, and O for overharvesting by hunting and fishing. So these were the 5 initial aspects of loss of biodiversity that we knew of. These were the causes that initially were thought of, but then there was a big addition that was done to this list, and this was climate change. Climate change being a concept that was not very prevalent, let's say 20 years back, where we were not looking at climate changing. But now, with so many evidences that we have for climate change, we know that climate change has become a big issue and something that needs to be countered very effectively and very soon. So this is something that was added to the list. So probably now the list becomes HIPCO. But to remember, if let's say you are going to the examination, HIPPO is one acronym that you should remember, so that you are able to recall in the examination if at all a question comes from this part. So one by one we need to understand and analyze all these causes of the loss. Now let's try to analyze each of these causes of the loss one by one and look at their impact. So first of all, we have H, that is habitat destruction. Try to look at the image that you have on your screen. We are looking at three different eras, and this is basically the map of, I hope you know, this is Ecuador. So when we talk about Ecuador, we are looking at three different eras. First, before European colonization, then in 1958, and the third evaluation that was done in 1998. So what you're looking at is a huge green patch, right? Before European colonization, the kind of biodiversity that might have existed here would be great, because the forest cover that we are looking at is very huge. But then after that, what we are looking at is that after colonization, we started to look at the patches, the habitat destruction, as we say, started to be observed here. And look at 1988. By 1988, you are looking at complete destruction of the natural habitat whatsoever. So this is the first thing that we know, that is habitat loss. Habitat loss can be a big problem, because as you lose habitat, and this is something that we discussed in the previous chapters also, when we are looking at the ecology and ecosystems, that if there is habitat loss, then the species that are residing there, it's impossible for them to reside anymore, because they will lose their habitat, they will lose their food sources, they lose the amount of space that they require for their survival. And with time, we'll see that all these kind of species will start to vanish from the given area. So habitat loss is what? The outright conversion of habitat to another use, such as urban development or agriculture, right? So if the habitat, due to anthropogenic reasons, we are converting the forest land, converting the natural habitat into, let's say, an urbanized region or an industry and agricultural patch, in each of these cases, what will happen is a habitat loss. And with habitat loss, what will happen is that all these species that used to survive here will either have to look for new areas where they can survive, or they will have to try to adjust to the new normal. And in most of the cases, this adjustment perhaps will not be possible. They'll not be able to survive the destruction. Then after that, there is something else apart from habitat loss, and that is habitat fragmentation, which is also seen to be as destructive as habitat loss. So what we are looking at is basically breaking up of one's continuous habitat into a series of habitat patches amid a human dominated landscape. So let's say if we knew that this is a forest area, now with habitat fragmentation, only certain patches everywhere will be left. And because of these patches that are left now, there will again be a difficulty that will be observed for the biodiversity to flourish, and many of the species will start to get reduced, start to get extinct because of that. And that is something that has been observed in the Indian context a lot of times. That, for example, let's say we take tiger, then in case of tigers, what we have seen is that although there are conservation activities which are going on in India, and perhaps these conservation activities are best in the world, but at the same time, we also know that there is rapid industrialization and rapid urbanization that has happened in India over the last 2 decades. And because of that, a lot of habitat has been lost. So this is not a complete destruction of habitat per se, but instead it is a fragmentation. But even fragmentation is not good, because what happens is, let's say we talked about tiger. So if you talk about tigers, then in case of tigers, we know that they need a good roaming space. They need at least 300 to 400 kilometers range to freely roam around, and that also helps them in increasing their gene pool, increasing the diversity of their genes at itself. But as soon as the fragmentation of these regions happen, now what will happen is the tigers perhaps will not move to other areas, and they will remain confined to just one area like this because of the fragmentation. And they know that there are human occupied spaces, there could be national highways, there could be other activities that might be going on in all these areas. They know that there's a risk, and they will not cross over to the other side. And in this case, what will happen is they will now start to remain confined in one area. And once they have started to remain confined in one area, what will happen next is there will be inbreeding. And because of inbreeding, what will happen is that the subsequent offsprings will not be as healthy as their parents or their ancestors. So ultimately, with 5 generations, 6 generations, 7 generations, this kind of a species will start to die off, because now they are not good enough to survive in the given environment. So this is something that will change over time, and ultimately it will lead to the extinction of an animal or a plant, whatever be the case. Then after that we have another term, that is habitat degradation, which refers to the changes that reduce the quality of habitat for many but not all the species. So many of the species are extra sensitive. We know that their requirements are much greater from a habitat as compared to many other species. So in these cases, let's say if the degradation of habitat happens, then in that case also we'll see that they will start to die off. For example, let's say pollution. There is no destruction of habitat that we are doing, there is no fragmentation of habitat that we are doing, but instead, because of a huge amount of pollution, it could be water pollution, air pollution, etc., there will be a degradation in the habitat. So for example, let's say it's a water ecosystem, freshwater ecosystem, and in this the water has started to get polluted, and because of the pollution that will happen, many of the species will not be able to survive it, and ultimately they will start to die. So even habitat degradation can be one of the factors, one of the causes of the loss. So when we talk about H, the first factor, that is habitat, then in that case you have habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and habitat degradation. These are the three factors that you need to understand. Then the second cause of the loss is I, and I, as we discussed, it stands for invasive species. So when we talk about the invasive species, you have two pictures on your screen. One is of Lantana camera and the second one is of Prosopis juliflora. So these have been two plants which have been seen to be invasive to India. So for example, Lantana camera, you will see that it has spread to across Western Ghats in the plateau region of India, Chotanagpur plateau to be exact. All these regions have started to see Lantana camera. Now when you talk about this particular plant, although it has flowers and probably can look beautiful to you, but what happens is that it starts to compete with the local species. It starts to compete with the native species, and ultimately the native species will not be able to survive or outmaster this species. They will start to die off. So ultimately the biodiversity of the region will start to shrink because of an invasive species like this. Similarly, about Prosopis juliflora also, what we know is that it has been, as you can see, it's a kind of shrub. So basically it was introduced in India to act as a firewood, but we did not know about how extensively it can spread, and it is something that can grow in sandy soil, in moist soil, in semi-arid soil. In all these different kinds of soil, it is able to grow. So ultimately what happened is, originally it was introduced to Tamil Nadu, and that is back in 1800s. And after that, we saw that there was a spread that started to happen in the southern and the central Indian regions, and ultimately we saw that this became a big problem for many of the states. You'll often see that this came in news in Tamil Nadu local newspapers, in Delhi newspapers, in Haryana newspapers, in Madhya Pradesh newspapers. All the local newspapers will show you the news articles with respect to Prosopis juliflora, which all of a sudden has started to become a big problem. And not all of a sudden, rather we can say that in last 2-3 decades we have seen that there have been various steps that have been taken so that it can be kept under control. So although it was introduced as a species, as a plant that will be able to provide some kind of ecosystem service, that is firewood, but ultimately what we are looking at is that it started to become an invasive species. It can grow in various kinds of soils, and it started to replace the native plants, and that is when it started to become a big problem for us. So this is the second cause of the loss of biodiversity. So when you talk about the invasive species, they have spread outside of their natural habitat and threaten biodiversity in the new area and are a major cause of biodiversity loss. These species are harmful to native biodiversity in a number of ways, for example, as predators. So we talked about only plant species, but we know that many of the predators are invasive. Many of the even small animals are invasive. For example, let's say rats. Rats are said to be hugely invasive species. For example, if you, let's say, introduce rat for one reason, it's not that they will stick to that reason. So they are also supposed to be invasive. Although you introduced them for some reason or the other which you thought was positive, but they also have a negative impact at the same time. It can be predators, it can be parasites, vectors that are carrier of diseases, and they ultimately become direct competitors for habitat and food wherever they get introduced. So that's why this is the second cause of loss of biodiversity. Then let's go to the third one, that is pollution. So when we talk about pollution, we know that there are two major aspects. One, the concept of bioaccumulation, and second, we know that due to pollution there will be health problems in many of the organisms, there will be breathing problems in them, and ultimately they will not be able to survive because of the habitat degradation that would happen because of pollution. So what is bioaccumulation? First, let's understand this. It is the process of chemicals becoming increasingly concentrated in animal tissues as they move up the food chain. So what happens is that there will be a small organism that would have ingested a chemical that could be harmful. Now what will happen is many of these species will be the food for a higher organism, a higher animal, let's say, and then this higher animal will be food for another higher animal which is higher in the food chain. So ultimately what is happening is something called as bioaccumulation, that we are looking at a little by little increase in the amount of chemicals that were present inside the animal, and as it moves up the ladder this amount starts to increase. And then apart from bioaccumulation, we also know that there are various factors. You know, air pollution has a huge impact. For example, nitrogen or sulfur based pollution that happens, they have a hugely negative impact on the survival of plants, and they will lead to the destruction of biodiversity. Similarly, many of the animals will not be able to survive because of the contamination in air or water in the habitat where they are supposed to live. So all these can be various reasons, and we know pollution has a big impact on humanity, but at the same time it also has a big impact on the biodiversity of all the other organisms as well. Then after that you have another P, that is population. Now when we talk about population, we know that because of increase in population the demands for all the ecological services will increase, there will be destruction of habitat that will happen, there will be an increase in pollution that will happen, and all these ultimately will lead to the extinction or disappearance of all the other species than humanity. So that's why what we have observed is, for example, in the year 1800 there were fewer than 1 billion people on the earth, and today, as per the data that I saw, it was written as 7.7 billion, and it is an ever increasing population. So we know that this number is increasing. It is increasing day by day. The earth's size does not change. You have the same number of resources, same amount of food and water that you can use. So ultimately there will be an issue that you will face, because all these natural resources will start to vanish, and after that we'll start to face a big problem. So because of population there will be habitat destruction, there will be even introduction of invasive species are many a times done by humans for one reason or the other. We know that pollution is also being caused because of anthropogenic reasons. So all these other causes that we saw, population becomes a big factor in controlling all these other causes. Then after that you have C, that is climate change. And what can be a better example than corals? We know that corals are sensitive species. They are species that can be destroyed very quickly. Even with slightest change in temperature, we see that they start to face the issues and they die off very quickly. We see that whenever El Nino years happen, a lot of corals are lost. But ultimately, due to climate change, what we are looking at is ocean acidification, one, and second, increase in the average temperature of the oceans. And because of the slight increase that we might not be able to observe even, this slight increase is more than enough for the corals to die off. And we already have staggering data which shows us how much of corals has been lost in the last 20 years or so because of climate change primarily. So this again becomes a very big challenge. So when you look at the causes of the loss with respect to climate change, we know that there will be temperature spikes, coral bleaching has been happening, there has been increase in extreme events. These extreme natural events also cause a lot of destruction to the habitat, and because of that some of the species might lose their populations. Then changes in the rainfall pattern has been observed, increased level of carbon dioxide and plant growth has been observed, and because of that we have seen some changes happening in the ecosystem and rise in sea level. This is also leading to the destruction of habitat. So all these will also lead to the loss of biodiversity. For example, when let's say sea level rises, the island ecosystem, which as we already discussed, Edward Wilson had called as the best kind of ecosystem that exists, most diverse ecosystem that exists, it will be the first one that will get affected. So the richest of the biodiversities will start to get affected the first when the sea levels rise. Similarly, increased amount of carbon dioxide not only creates a problem for the air, breathing of the air, but also leads to ocean acidification. And because it leads to ocean acidification, it will again be a problem both for terrestrial ecosystems and for aquatic ecosystems. So for both the kinds of ecosystems, it will be a real threat. Then after that, we have O, that stands for over exploitation. So over exploitation or unsustainable use happens when biodiversity is removed faster than it can be replenished, and over the long term can result in the extinction of species. So we know that, and the same thing that we have been talking about, overuse of resources will lead to extinction of species. And when you talk about the examples, there are multiple examples that we have. For example, we have the cod fish that has disappeared from Canada. Then you have the freshwater snakes in Cambodia that have been declining because of human pressure. There are huge number of fish species, mammal species, etc. that are being killed for one reason or the other. They are being hunted for one reason or the other, and because of that their population has been declining very fast, and very soon we'll see that they might face extinction. They might face complete destruction of their populations, and this is true for many organisms. The list is unthinkable. We talked about sharks. We talked about the fact that the number of sharks that we kill in a year is a staggering number, and because it's a big market, big economic activity, no one really thinks about them. Similarly, in various parts of the world you will see that this happens. For example, many of the endemic species, many of the very important threatened species are still being killed in China and the nearby areas because they are being used in traditional medicines, they are being used as food. Although maybe after COVID they might have learned some lesson, but that has a very feeble chance. But we know that in these kind of countries there has been a huge demand for many of the animals for variety of reasons. It could be food, it could be cosmetics, it could be medicine, it could be clothing, it could be any of these factors, and we have seen that because of all these there has been a huge pressure. For example, we have a very important example here, that is pangolins. So we have seen that pangolins for their scales have been in huge demand in China and also in Vietnam. And because of that, you will see that in China they were hugely hunted. They have almost vanished from China, and even in India they are being hunted because they are then smuggled into China. So it's not only in China where the pangolins face this issue, but even in India they are facing this issue, and because of that we have seen that it has now become a central focal point for many of the discussions that we have at international fora. So this becomes another reason for loss of biodiversity. So just remember how these factors come into the picture, what are the effects, all these factors that will be important for the examination directly. Then after that we have various other reasons. For example, you can talk about diseases. If there is a disease that happens in an individual population, a species which is not very genetically diverse already, then in that case their chances of dying off is very high. So that will happen. So anthropogenic activities may increase the incidences of diseases in wild species, leading to their extinction. Can I give you an example? COVID-19. Where did it start from? It started probably, I mean we are still saying probably, that it started from bats. And from bats, we just talked about pangolins. Pangolins are also said to be one of the recipients of the coronavirus, and from there it is supposed to have invaded the humans. So just see that why it happened. You can see that there are activities in China. Now where the coronavirus started from, I know that it's controversial, but beyond a reasonable doubt it still can be said that China was the one from where it started to spread, and the reasons if you can see the reasons, you will understand that the way in which China has a market for all the exotic species, that definitely will cause the problem. And that is why we have seen that China in the past also has been one of the reasons for many of these kind of diseases coming into the picture. So this is one. Then after that, shifting or jhum cultivation. So with jhum cultivation, what happens is there is a partial destruction of habitat in a given area that will happen. The jhum agriculture will be done there, and once this area has been used properly, the tribals will move on to another area and the jhum agriculture will be done there. So this kind of shifting agriculture is also something that affects biodiversity. Then after that, poaching of wildlife, of course it's a big problem, and we have seen that some of the species effectively started to vanish because of the hunting activities. We have a example in India, for example, cheetah. Cheetah is one species that was extensively hunted. I mean, starting 1800s, if you look at the figures of mid 1800s and then 1947, in mid 1800s, from having a population of maybe 30,000 to 40,000 cheetahs, at the end of 1947 they have already vanished, and last three were infamously killed by a Maharaja in Chhattisgarh. So by 1949 they had vanished from India. So Asiatic cheetahs that were supposed to be the fastest animals, they vanished from the face of the earth just because of hunting activities. They used to be prized possessions at the time of the British in India. So because of all these kind of activities, they vanished. And same has been the case with many other organisms as well. So poaching of wildlife has also been a big factor in the destruction of biodiversity.